welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Ahmed
and Eric Olson.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Westin MCAT podcast with Ahmed and Eric. Today, we're going to talk about different theories of development, talking about Freud and Piaget and Erikson. But before we get into that, Eric, I know we were just chatting that you're doing a little bit more research in your residency. What does that entail? Like, do you get to choose what you're researching, or like, how does that work?
Yeah. Let me just say before I get into it, Ahmed, your intro is so smooth. When you're not around, it's me and Jaden. It's like kind of a mess. Like we don't know what to do. So kudos to you for doing that every week.
Been rehearsing in front of the mirror, man. It takes time.
There you go. It's paying off. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think research requirements in residency are kind of variable. Some programs you have to do research. Some programs don't care. Some programs you have like specified years, like a lot of neurosurgery programs, for example, neurosurgery residency is 7 years. And in a lot of those programs, I think years 4 and 5 are like dedicated research time. So you kind of leave your clinical duties behind and spend some specific time doing research, which is nice if you're interested in that, I guess.
Right.
For my program, it is not a requirement, but it is, encouraged. And I think, depending on kind of your interests and things, people get into it, or a lot of our residents just don't get into it at all. And I think most of us in dermatology have done some degree of research as medical students. And I think people kind of decide, like, either I'm interested in this and I want to keep doing it, or I don't care and I'm going to just be a clinician.
Right.
And that's it. I have done, a decent amount of research starting as an undergrad, and most of that was basic science at the time. And then, you have more opportunities for kind of clinical research as a medical student. But part of it depends on the mentorship that you run into. So like as a med student, I had some times where I was working with an individual and they said, "Hey, I have an idea for this project. Would you like to help me?" Either if sometimes it was a case and they would say, do you want to help me write up this case? Or other times they would say, do you want to help me conduct this research? But in the same vein, there were times where I went to, mentors and people who I knew were interested in research and said, "Hey, I have this idea. Here's kind of what it is." And I think the same thing exists in residency programs. In some programs, there are, established channels of specific physicians who are really interested and get the residents involved. In our program, there's not too much of that. At least it hasn't been my experience yet. And maybe that's because I'm early enough that people are trying to not burden me down with research. But, for me, I've had a couple of ideas of things that I'm kind of moving along in the works and finding the right people to kind of facilitate that and support it from a faculty standpoint. And then a couple of other projects that are being conducted by residents that I've, gotten wind of and said, "Hey, this sounds really interesting to me. Can I get on board?" And so some of those things are like, I think when I was a med student, it was like, what can I do to like run a trial or like, get really involved with patient care, or do like a chart review project or something like that, where you're looking at outcomes of patients who are on treatment X versus treatment Y or things like that.
Right.
And some of what we're doing is that, but some of it is like going online and like looking what people are saying about this or that. There's been a lot of things published recently about AI and like how AI respond. I haven't worked at any of that recently or at all, but we had a paper out of our program that was published recently about like the use of artificial intelligence in like drafting responses to patient questions in the inbox, right? So like patients will reach out and say, I've been taking this medicine and like my stomach has been hurting. Like, is that related? And is there another medication I should try? And so there's this question of like, could I just put that question into ChatGPT and like see what it says and then fact check it as a physician, right?
Yeah.
I haven't really dabbled in any of that, but there's a lot of kind of research out there right now of like, is this an appropriate tool that we could be using or is it not?
Right.
Anyway, it's nice, the more you get into a field, the more you kind of understand what the questions are, and the more whether or not other people have those questions, you kind of formulate questions of your own,
Yeah.
and you just figure out how to address them. And so it has been fun to kind of sort some of those things out, but it's definitely a lot when you are trying to figure out kind of the basics of your field and then trying to like produce something novel as well from a research standpoint. And
Right. Right.
like I said, I did a lot of research in undergrad and med school, and like I like doing research, so I am interested in continuing to do it. But it's a balancing act, I guess kind of like anything else in education and school, you have to kind of figure out how much time you can dedicate to one thing or another. In fact, Jaden and I are working on a project together
Oh,
that he's
yeah.
heading up with a bunch of people out of Michigan, and he was nice enough to include me on it. That's about we're gonna do a review of like silicone treatments for scar, improve like cosmesis and things like that, and try to
Okay.
kind of gather all the literature that's out there and what it says, and put it all together into a review. So that's something we're working on together right now. It's kind of fun.
Nice.
But I
That's
was going
sweet,
to ask
man.
you, you were just telling me before we started that you had an exam this week, and I think you're on a new block.
Yeah.
What is the new block? What are you guys getting into now?
So it's not even like our blocks are not like necessarily structured a certain way. It's just like different courses that build off of, things that we've previously covered or dive into new details. I was reading somewhere in our like course platform, they actually had like a somewhat reasonable name for this blog, and I'll try to pull it up. But we just had like the way we work is like we have tests like every other week or every 3 weeks
Yeah.
and no final exams, which is actually much appreciated. Um, but yeah, it's just it's an important time in the sense that like, you want to start strong, right? And you want to, because we're pass fail, right? So if you can get a couple of like passes with buffer room early, you're kind
You anchor yourself high, and
of,
then you're feeling good moving on.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't know if I necessarily did that today. I think I,
What was it on? What was the topic?
it was peds and health promotion. The health promotion stuff was like right up my alley. It was like exercise requirements and
Yeah.
some of the physiology of exercise adaptations, like preload and afterload. Like that stuff is like that was my bread and butter in undergrad. But there was an anatomy component to it as well. And some of our anatomy questions are like almost too specific. It's like it'll give you a structure and it'll say like what's like directly adjacent to this, looking like from the inferior surface. And I'm like,
Ah, brutal.
I looked at the picture, like I know what this organ
Yeah.
is, but
Yeah.
like apparently not enough detail. But it is what it is. To be like fair, like even like the last block we had, I didn't study as well for the first one. I think that trend continued on this one, but
Yeah.
like always well enough. So hopefully add some more buffer room with this next test. But like the next one coming
Yeah.
up. That'll be a
Yeah.
little bit more challenging though. Just I'm gonna be away for a little bit, but gotta stay disciplined and have some initiative to get things done early. But in any case, in terms of those theories of cognitive development that we ultimately wanted to get into, really there's three. There's Freud, there's Piaget, there's Erikson. I would say Piaget and Erikson are probably the two more commonly tested ones than Freud. But what's common to all three, I would say, is anytime you see an age in a psych-social passage, you've got to be thinking of one of these three theories because it's one of the most common question types. You get an age of some group in a study, and they ask you, the children in study one are in which phase of Freud's theory of psychosexual development, or Erickson's conflict resolution, etc. And so what we'll do today is we'll kind of just run through each of those three theories, like what they sort of describe, stages of them.
This is right up your alley of doing a PEDS exam this week, huh?
So it's funny, the Piaget stuff actually has a lot of overlap with some developmental milestones in
Yeah, no
pediatrics.
question.
And maybe that's where we can start. So starting with that theory of cognitive development, we've got 4 stages for Piaget. We've got the sensory motor stage, then we've got pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational.
Yeah.
And so starting with sensory motor, the name kind of tells you a lot of what you need to know. You're developing senses and you're developing, fine and gross motor skills.
Yeah.
And so this is, as far as this theory goes, we say that it's from age 0 to 2. And then some of the hallmarks will be, we start seeing language. We see object permanence. That was a, big developmental milestone that we were emphasizing in medical school over the past couple of weeks, was just, roughly around the 6-month mark, we start to see object permanence, and the kids start playing peekaboo, I think at like roughly 6 to 9 months, in that range.
Yeah. In that range.
Yeah, and like every child is a little bit different, but that's really the big one, is the presence of object permanence.
With these Piaget stages, and within these stages, really, because I remember like learning about Freud. Like I learned about Freud in high school, and then I learned about Freud again in college, and then I learned about Freud again when I was getting ready for the MCAT, and then I think you talk about Freud again in med school, maybe. And
I hope not.
At a certain point, I was like, "Why are we talking like this? Is like debunked, basically, right?" And I think there are some like modalities of psychotherapy that still kind of take from some of these concepts, but part of it is like Freud was the first guy who like started thinking about like how do people develop, and like how do people think, and how does the subconscious play into this whole process. And these other stages of psychosocial development with Erikson and Piaget, like no one of them is like a comprehensive or 100% accurate like depiction of what development looks like, right? But taken together and in pieces, like they do kind of paint a picture of some of the processes that are going on, and some of kind of how we interact with ourselves and with our environment, and kind of what cognitive development looks like. And so, I guess, when I was learning it, I was very much a skeptic and kind of like, this is worthless, and this is like just an exercise in memorizing something. And, you maybe not will need all of these things specifically, but I do think, it does play into an overall understanding of what development looks like over a period of time. And there are specific things that are really helpful. Like you said, even in medical school, I mean, I think if you're going to take one thing away from the sensory motor stage of Piaget's development, it's object permanence, right? Like that's the big key thing. And I believe there's another big key thing for the pre-operational stage of development. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So conservation, right? Like the idea that, if I pour water from a tall glass into a wide glass, it's still the same amount of water. Right. So that's something that develops in the pre-operational stage. There's so many videos out there of like 3 or 4-year-olds, saying that the tall glass has more water, but then eventually they figure out, wait a minute, it's the same cup, right? Or it's the same water. It's just being poured from one cup to another. And so we start to see, imagination a little bit, developing. There's this concept of like symbolic thinking, but the big one there for pre-operational, like you mentioned, is going to be that conservation. We're still lacking a little bit in like abstract thought. We're lacking a little bit in like problem solving. So there's still obviously more room for development at this point. But to recap so far, sensory motor, big hallmarks are, object permanence and starting to speak, developing gross and fine motor skills. And then we get into pre-operational. Big hallmark there as far as the MCAT is concerned will be that aspect of conservation. From there, we get into the concrete operational stage from 7 to 11 years old, pre-operational being 2 to 7. And now, we start seeing, an understanding of things like time, space, amounts, but bless you. There at this stage, the hallmark is like you're missing this ability to think theoretically and abstract, right? You're thinking more concrete, right? So, 10 minutes have passed by, or there are 4 apples there, or there's a distance of however much between me and the building, but it's not abstract, which we see in formal operational from 11 years and older, where you start thinking strategically, right? Like, if I want to, make a U-turn, for example, but it's not permissible, I can make, a right, a left, a left, a left, and then mission accomplished, right?
Yeah.
So things like that, where you can sort of visualize and manipulate information in your head, that's now the standard of the formal operational stage. And Eric, I'm curious, like when I study this stuff, I just always knew the ages, the names, and like what's the major sort of milestone or development in each of those stages. I'm wondering, like, did you have a different method? Like, how did you kind of go about committing those things to
I
memory?
agree with you. I think the beautiful thing about these different stages is that you don't have to be able to recount everything about them. Like you have to know them well enough to really
Right.
everything on the MCAT, right? Like it's a multiple choice exam. You have to know it well enough to be able to pick it out, right? And so if you have some concept of these different pieces, then you can hopefully be able to pick it out. And I think part of the framework that it's helpful to understand is exactly what you're saying. Like, what is the name of this thing? What are the rough ages? And hopefully they
Right.
don't give you someone who's like 3 years old, because then or like 2 years old, they're right on the cusp of like sensory motor versus pre-operational, right?
Yeah.
But like, the kind of the rough age range, the name, and then like a big concept. So like for sensory motor, it's going to be object permanence. For pre-operational, it's going to be conservation. Um, and just remembering kind of those big like buzzword concepts, because those are really the
Yeah.
things that they're going to be testing on, right? Like they're not going to give you some sort of example of something that you have no idea what to do with and are unfamiliar with. Like they're gonna if they're
Right.
picking these things up, they're talking about the big points. And so I think these stages can be daunting. Piaget's may be a little bit more approachable than some of the others, because like Erickson's, I remember spending a lot of time on, because there's so many stages and you're like, I
Yeah.
don't remember all this stuff. But again, like I think, having a it doesn't have to be like a perfect understanding of all of it to be able to
Right.
answer these questions, right? And if you have kind of a framework, then you can work off of that.
Yeah, I think the point you made there is so important. Like, don't get caught trying to remember every single detail, right? Like, I don't think that's the best use of our time as students. Like, I
Yeah.
think, I'm a big proponent of like the more that we can just understand and conceptualize, the less we have to commit to rote memorization,
Yeah.
and the better we are, right? Like I think it's it's just a matter of like how are you going to try to process the information so that it sticks with the least amount of effort possible, right? And so whatever that process looks like for our students, I would encourage you guys to reflect and maybe experiment even. But it's important to find a way to retain information on a need to know basis almost, right? Like there's a lot on the MCAT and there's certainly a lot in Psych Soc, and so you kind of have to prioritize the highest yield things, right? And so for the Piaget's theory, right, we're thinking object permanence in in sensory motor, conservation, centration is another term. There's a couple of other concepts in pre-operational, but those are sorts of the main ones. We talked about, you know, concepts being applied to concrete situations and concrete operational. So thinking, space and time and quantity, etc. And then thinking abstractly, theoretically, strategically, and formal operational.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that's going to be Piaget. I think the next one that you kind of mentioned briefly there was Erickson. And this one is, in my opinion, actually the most intuitive of the three.
I don't disagree. You can figure it out if you think about it.
Yeah, like this is one.
If you've seen it once or twice, you can kind of intuit it.
Some of them aren't super obvious, but some of them make a lot of sense. And so we can start by just listing all the stages and what conflicts they're resolving, and then dive into them in a little bit more detail.
Okay.
So we've got from 0 to 1 year old, we've got trust versus mistrust. 1 to 3, we've got autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. 3 to 6, we've got initiative versus guilt. 6 to 12 was industry versus inferiority. 12 or 13, I guess, to 19 was identity versus role confusion. 20 to 45, I think, was intimacy versus isolation. 45 to 40 to, or maybe it was 40 to 20 to 40, 40 to 65 was generativity versus stagnation. And then 65 plus was integrity versus despair. And so a lot of these make a lot of sense, and we'll go in order, but I feel like
the early ones are kind of harder.
Yes.
The further along you get, the easier, the more obvious it becomes.
To me, once you get to the industry versus inferiority, it starts to click a little bit more. But 0 to 1, trust versus mistrust, think of it as just stranger danger, right? That's kind of how I remembered it, was friendly or not friendly face, right? Can I trust you, or can I not?
That's what that happens in that stage, right? When is stranger danger? Do you remember? Is it 6 or 9 months or something like that?
So stranger anxiety was actually on my test, so I should know this answer.
You should know it.
I want to say stranger anxiety developed at 9 months.
9 months. So there you go. It's within that 0 to 1 year framework.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. You think, I guess, as a dad, I think of the complete dependence, right, of an infant on its parents, and particularly its mother. And so there's complete, if not involuntary, trust on the part of the infant. They have no choice.
Yeah.
So I think that is you develop a trusting relationship, and in individuals in whom that relationship doesn't occur, then you have serious consequences down the road. And a lot of mental health disorders are linked to early childhood trauma and things like that. And so even from the 0 to 1 stage, that trust versus, is it distrust, mistrust?
Yeah. Lack of trust.
Is an important thing. It really is.
Right. And so one thing I just want to touch on briefly, with Erickson, his thought process is if you successfully resolve the conflict, great. If not, you still move on to the next stage. That's going to be in contrast to Freud, who says if you don't, meet the, objectives or the, milestones of the stage, you're stuck in it until you do, kind of thing.
Right.
But more on that later. Second stage with Erickson, we've got autonomy versus shame and self-doubt, right? So, the ability to just be in control, right? Can you pick your own food, right? Can you move around independently, right? Can you behave autonomously, right? Is kind of the idea there.
Yeah.
So I never really had a good way to remember that one. I just knew the autonomy came second. But
I don't know if I could give you a great example. I certainly didn't have one when I was a student, but again, maybe I'm going to draw on my kids for all of these. Although we're reaching the threshold of the age of my kids. The older one is almost 4, so we're pretty much at the end of the growth here. But I will say that kids start to learn to be potty trained in this age range, like 2 to 3-ish.
Yep.
And it has been interesting, um, when like you think about autonomy and being able to control your bladder and bowels, right? I guess is
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it now. And the interesting contrast I think that I'm seeing now is like this shame and self-doubt question. And like in current, popular thought of how to potty train and things like that. Like I think your instinct of like when a kid has an accident is to be like give him a scolding and be like, no, don't do that. Like, you can be better than that and you're gonna be in trouble if that happens again, sort of a thing. Or at least that's my instinct. Maybe that means I'm a bad dad. I don't know. But
I mean,
the current wisdom is like don't make it a bad experience. Don't shame them effectively. Like, don't produce that doubt that they're unable to control themselves, but instead, tell them it's okay and, that they can improve next time, that we'll try again and things like that. And so encouraging that. And then when they are successful, to be really excited for them. And, do I think that's a perfect method of potty training? Not exactly, because it hasn't been like a perfect method for my kids, at least. But
right.
but I think the principle is there, like exactly what we're talking about, like this autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. And so on the one hand, you have, a 2-year-old who's like learning to control themselves and being successful at potty training and having that autonomy of like being able to go to the bathroom when they want. Versus, on the other hand, if you were parenting in a certain sort of way that you would germinate shame and self-doubt of I can't do this, like I'm getting in trouble, I don't know how, I'm being unsuccessful. And I think that would be kind of the contrast that I would see. Again, like I didn't think of it this way when I took the MCAT, but just for the sake of, giving you guys an example
Yeah.
the life of kind of how maybe that's what Erickson was going through with his kids and that's what he was thinking. I don't know.
And you know what? It's a perfect transition to the next stage, right? So autonomy, like I can go to the bathroom by myself. And then initiative versus guilt from 3 to 6 years old. I will go to the bathroom by myself, right?
Yeah.
It's not just I have the choice and the ability to, but I actually can do it.
I'm
Right?
going to, yeah.
I can do things, and then I actually do them, right? So it's
Yeah.
not just obviously, potty training and such, but having the initiative to clean up your toys, right? Having the initiative to what initiative do you need at 5 years old? I'm trying to think back to those days, but
You don't need that much, but you're figuring it out, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, this was kind of like the last one for me. That's a little bit like
That's a tougher one. Yeah.
yeah, like, but honestly, I just think about the toys, right? Clean up your toys, before, mom or dad scolds you or yells at you or whatever. From here, though, it gets a little bit easier, right? So industry versus inferiority, I think about, you start to get into like fifth grade, graduating elementary school, moving into middle school, right? From 6 to 12 years old, right? It's about fitting in, right? Making friends, feeling like you belong, right? That
Yeah.
having that industry, that network versus feeling inferior. I think that one started to make a little sense for me. That's how I thought about it back when I was studying. I think, that's a pretty common way to do it. But were you think about it any differently there, Eric?
No, I similar to you, I guess. I just thought of it in like terms of kind of when did I start caring about school? And maybe that's because I'm a nerd and it made sense to me. But like, the end of elementary school, I started kind of being like, okay, this maybe actually matters. And like, yeah, I guess it's pretty early now that I'm saying it out loud. But that was the point where I was like, I can either try and be good at this, or I can just, not really care.
Right.
Kind of started to make a decision to like study, and I wasn't really studying as a fourth grader, but like, meet the goals of, a fourth grader or whatever that might have been.
Yeah, just as an aside, I was putting in work from
Really?
like second to fifth grade, not by choice. Like my school had this like enrichment stream where like there's a class of like second and third graders together and a class of fourth and fifth graders together. And so you kind of got this alternating mentee mentor role over 4 years. And we were doing some wild things, man. Like I remember I damn near pulled an all-nighter in the fourth grade making this big map of the Odyssey, like Odysseus's
Nice.
journey.
Sounds cool.
I don't think we definitely didn't read like the original Odyssey because that thing's like yay thick. But I want to say we read like a kid's version, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
Some along the lines. And I just had like, man, I went all out. I had like the different colors of Play-Doh for like the ocean and the continents. And I had like this like glitter gel thing that I was like using as like a map, and I put the flags in it. And
I'd like to see a photo of this. I feel like we need to find some evidence of this.
I don't know that the photos exist, but
You
it
got to talk to
definitely
your
happened.
mom. You got to talk to your
I'll
mom.
shoot her a message, but I remember my mom being up with me and helping me work through this thing. And she was just like, fourth grade? Like,
She was like, "What's next?
yeah.
Where
And
is this gonna go?"
it only got easier from there until like
Yeah.
middle of high school. But anyway, that's a story for another day. But so yeah,
So
I
there you
guess
go. Industry as a fourth grader. It's perfect. Perfect example.
yeah, I mean, I guess you could look at it two ways, right? Like I looked at it more from a social standpoint, but you looked at it from an academic standpoint. I think both
Yeah.
are, you know,
Yeah.
totally great and really just whatever resonates with the student. Uh, from here, the rest of these, I would dare say, make a lot of sense. So
Yeah.
12 to 19, 20, identity versus role confusion, right? Just figuring out who you are. I think, with puberty and, becoming a young adult, right? That's a, not insignificant, conflict to resolve. And so I think, just reflecting at least on my life, and I think the common, development from, early teens to late adolescence, right? It's really just about figuring out who you are. Um, from there, you get into 20 to 40 range. You got to start, family planning, right? Finding that special someone. So that's going to be our intimacy versus isolation stage, right? Um, typically the average person gets married, I think somewhere in their late 20s, early 30s, if I remember correctly. But like
Uh-huh.
of all the stages of Erickson's conflict resolution theory, 20 to 40 makes the most sense for this intimacy versus isolation resolution.
Yeah.
Um, Next one makes a lot of sense, especially for med students and future doctors, generativity versus stagnation, right? Like, what are you going to accomplish in your career, right? And for the most part, like your career prior to the age of 40 as a doctor is relatively abbreviated unless you go into like family practice. And so that's kind of how I always thought about that one, right? Like really just like leaving a legacy, right? Is that 40 to 65 uh, sort of window of your life. And then 65 till, end of life, right? Integrity versus despair, right? Do you feel, proud of the life you lived, or are you in regret, right? In
Yeah.
despair. Uh, there's a lot of steps there, and there's a lot of conflicts and ages and such. I think the ages, like just, they'll click kind of the more you look at it. But I think especially those last four conflicts, I'm hoping that, if our students can take the time to reflect on them, uh, they will make sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as you said, I agree. Those last few are a little bit more intuitive. And so for me, it was like those made sense, and I had to spend a little bit more time on the others, the earlier stages. But for others, it might be different. And honestly, if I were gonna, well, I don't know. I was gonna say if I was gonna learn one, I would learn the later ones because I think they're easier to remember and you're more likely to stick with it. But I think if you're gonna you should just learn them all. You should be familiar with them all.
Yeah. No,
Probably better, honestly, to focus more on those earlier ones because they're harder to intuit.
yeah.
Whereas if they give you something about someone who's 26, then you can. It's easier to think that it might be about a relationship or something like that.
Right. Right.
It is kind of an
Yeah.
interesting question. I had thought about this earlier. Like,
Sure.
I don't disagree with you at all, and I almost hesitate to say it because I don't want to confuse anyone. But I feel like in our society, like it's almost the stage of 20 to 45 and the state or 40 to 65 are almost flipped a little bit. Like I feel like we in medicine, we focus a lot more on our career on the front end, like from 20.
Okay.
People like don't even, I mean, people would like date and stuff, but I don't know. It almost seems like we are so career oriented until we're like mid 30s, late 30s,
Yeah.
and then we start thinking about like a family and things like that. And so whereas I think about like, what was it in Ericsson's time? I don't know when Ericsson was like around and doing this stuff, but it was like at the
Yeah.
earliest, probably like late 1800s, and at the latest, like probably 1950s or something. I don't really know. But whenever it was, like people were having families earlier. People were like finding a spouse and settling down in their early 20s and having kids.
Right.
And then, by the time they were in their 40s and 50s, then their kids were probably already gone. And that was when they, maybe had more of this crisis of like, am I going to, create something with my work and career, or am I going to,
Right.
decide to do nothing? And again, like I hesitate to even say that because I don't want to confuse people. But again, like for me, it was like putting myself in the context of like Ericsson's time and what were people doing at these different stages along, their lifetimes at that time.
Yeah.
But again, these later stages are the easy ones. Don't think twice about it. Focus on the early ones. They require more thought and more cognition to figure them out.
And you know what though? Sometimes like having that like wait a minute and then like figuring it out kind of actually helps it stick even better.
Yeah,
So
yeah. You think it through, and yeah, it'll stick.
exactly. But to wrap up, uh we've got Freud's theory of psychosexual development. It's a little
Good
bit
old Floyd.
different. Yeah. Bit of
I
an
love him.
interesting fella.
I'm very
Uh
interested.
kind of like you alluded.
Have you ever seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure?
I have not.
It's like from probably the 90s
Okay.
or
Sounds like a
maybe
90s kind of
earlier.
thing. Yeah.
It's set in the 80s, I think. Now I'm
Okay.
like just all over the place, but basically it's these guys who like this is not really relevant, but it's these guys who like have to write like a paper for high school for like their history class.
Okay.
And they like eventually will go on to like form this great rock band, and it like saves the world basically. And
Okay.
so the future sends a time machine back to Bill and Ted in like the 1980s.
Okay.
And they like send this time machine to help Bill and Ted create their like history essay or whatever. And so as part of their project, they like go to different time periods and like collect historical figures. And
Was
then they like
Freud one of
bring
them?
them all to do this presentation at the end. And they get like Genghis Khan, and they get like Billy the Kid, and they get Socrates and all these guys. But one of the people they get is Freud. And so
Nice.
that was like I watched that movie probably in middle school, and that was like my first introduction to Freud. And they don't really talk
Yeah.
about who he is or what he did, but that's what I always think of is Bill and
Hey.
Ted's Excellent Adventure. Worth a watch, if you have the time. I know you're busy, but
Yeah, yeah.
better.
I'll add it to my list. Sweet. Okay. So yeah, like Freud just doesn't like there's a lot going on. We'll put it that way. Like Freud
Yeah.
was a bit of a madman, like very very interesting train of thought.
He used a
Uh
lot of cocaine. That's a fun fact about Freud.
yeah, I was beating around that bush, but hey,
It's just
better
a fact.
yeah. He like well, it's just like you can kind of tell from like some of his work that he was an abstract thinker, to put it mildly.
For sure.
And you see it in this theory of psychosexual development, right? It's I remember there being a mnemonic for this, and I can't remember what it is, but similar to Erickson, the age of the first handful of stages is very similar. 0 to 1, 1 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to like 12-ish, and then
12 plus.
beyond.
Yeah.
Starting with the oral stage, right? Oral, mouth, sucking your thumb and putting things in your mouth, etc. Okay. Then we got the anal stage, so potty training, kind of in line with what we talked about with Erickson and what we know just from pediatric development. Phallic stage is where things get a little bit interesting. You start having, attraction to your parent of the opposite sex.
The Oedipus complex sort of thing that came from Freud.
Exactly.
Excuse me.
And I remember there were two terms. One was penis envy, and there was another. I can't remember what the second one was off the top of my head, but penis envy is basically the son becomes jealous of the father for being married and intimate with the mother, essentially. And so,
is that? I thought penis envy was like a female wanting to have a penis because for whatever. Let's look it up. I'm actually really interested to know now.
I'm like 95% sure. But yeah, double check me and let me know. But
the very first response on Google is penis envy is when female children only realize
actually
penis, they feel castrated in comparison to males.
And what am I describing then? Maybe this is the second term that
I think that's Oedipus complex. That's the Oedipus complex thing.
You might be right.
Do you know the story of Oedipus?
I do not.
Oh man, that's a doozy too. That's like a. I'm gonna butcher it because I don't know it super well, but it's like a Greek mythology sort of thing.
Okay.
And Oedipus is like a dude who, I don't know. He was born to like a royal family or something, and then somehow he got separated from his parents. I'm sure there's more backstory than that, but that's what I can remember. And then at a certain point, he like goes on a voyage once he's grown up. And he like meets his parents on the road, but he doesn't know that they're his parents, right?
Okay.
And you're like king and queen of this kingdom. I'm probably again, this is probably not right, but this is what I remember of it. And basically, like he gets in a fight with his dad, and he kills his dad.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oedipus kills his father, and then he becomes ruler of the kingdom, and then over time he like starts becoming intimate with his mother. And so the Oedipus complex is this idea of like a son and a mother being intimate together. And so the Oedipus complex is that idea of, and there's one for like females.
Electra complex.
There you go. That's a thing. These are all Freud things. Again, like maybe not quite so based in reality, but ideas that you had.
And like I said at the beginning, Freud's probably the least tested of the three.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't stress it terribly much. Like I would be familiar with them, but within reason. From there we get into the latency stage. This one's really just hallmarked by hanging out with same-sex peers. We start resolving some of those challenges of the phallic stage, moving into the latency stage. And then from there, we move into the genital stage beyond puberty, where the individual, the person becomes more attracted to opposite sex peers, more sexually active, etc.
Let me give you another pop culture reference. Have you seen The Office?
Have I seen the what? Sorry,
The Office.
Yeah.
Okay. So you know Robert California.
Okay, yeah.
Robert California is like the CEO of the business overarching corporation that owns like the people at Dunder Mifflin in The Office in the later seasons.
Yeah.
Sorry for anyone who doesn't know this because that was not a great explanation, but basically like he's this also very eccentric guy, and he like part of his philosophy is like that everything is about sex, that like every interaction you have is like rooted in sexual attraction, basically. The long and short of his sort of philosophy. And that's kind of how I view Freud's what is this genital stage that we're talking about is the last stage.
Yeah.
Is that like, and there are people that like believe this stuff, is that like everything that we do is kind of like is rooted in like the possibilities of sexual conquest kind of a situation. And we don't have to get into it too much more than that. But I think to me, that's his idea, is like everything, every interaction, every motivation that you have kind of from, that period of like 12-ish, 13 puberty age on,
right,
is about is about sex. Everything is sex, as Robert would say. And part of the Freudian, and you alluded to this when we were talking about Erickson, that when you, regardless of if you, resolve a stage or not, you're moving on to the next stage in Erickson's theories. Whereas Freud would say, if you don't figure it out, then you're going to be stuck there. And so when people say, this is where like the phraseology of like, I'm anal about such and such, is this idea that like you never figured out how to control your bowels basically as a 2-year-old or whatever. And so you have this like need to control things. And so when people say I'm anal retentive, it's like they're anally fixated, i.e. they have that like need for control, right?
Yeah.
And similar with like an oral fixation, like, I bite my nails on occasion, and that would be like Freud would say that I'm orally fixated because I never figured that out.
Right.
And so I still feel this like need to have something in my mouth. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so those are, and so Freud again would say like, if you don't figure it out, if you don't resolve that stage, then you're stuck there, and like you'll just never get past it.
Yeah. And that I was looking for that word, fixation. I knew there was a term that we used, and thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, so maybe to recap then, we talked about Freud, we talked about Piaget, we talked about Erickson, and without maybe getting into all those stages and ages again, I think the biggest take-home points are, try to make sense out of what's happening in each of these stages where at all possible, right? Many of the Erickson stages, many of the Freud stages, I would say probably Piaget is the hardest one to maybe make sense out of, like what is pre versus concrete versus formal operational mean. Say maybe that's a little bit more challenging, but again, within reason, trying to make sense out of the information in front of us. And then explain it to somebody else, right? Like go explain it to somebody else. I think that's one of the best ways to make things stick. And then from there, right, just being able to answer practice questions, reinforce what you learned, and leveraging spaced repetition to make sure that, we see the information frequently enough where, we're retaining it. I think that's really the recipe for success across psych soc, but especially with something like this where there's a lot of information within a very narrow sort of range, we'll say, like a very narrow topic. Anything you want to add to that, Eric?
No, I agree. I mean, I think concepts are most important, kind of broad strokes, but I agree with this idea of spaced repetition. And I was just thinking about, when I moved to Brazil and I was like trying to learn Portuguese, and
you moved to Brazil?
But we haven't talked about this.
I vaguely remember you said you were learning Portuguese. It's something about you used it in an interview.
Oh, no, I was a missionary in Brazil for 2 years. The interview thing is like, I came back and then, I was in the States for 3 more years before I was interviewing for med schools. And at one interview, I had written on my application that I speak Portuguese, which I did at the time, like very well still.
Yeah.
And I still do speak some, but the interviewer like came in and speaking Portuguese, and I was kind of caught off guard, and I like didn't do a very good job of responding.
Yeah.
She switched to English, and I could tell she was like not impressed, and then I didn't get it right. But and maybe it was because of that, and maybe it was because I was just a bad interviewer or whatever. But I was gonna say, when I was learning Portuguese, and it was super hard, and like it's a lot of information. And one of the things that I did was I would, like, before I went to bed, I would write down like 10 to 20 words depending on the day that I like had learned during the day or had thought about or that I wanted to learn or whatever.
Right.
And I would run through, what they all meant in my head, and then I would write on a notebook and I would put it under my pillow and I would go to sleep. And I think there's a little bit more to it than that, but I was just going to say, like, this idea of kind of writing something down from scratch, I think is really helpful too.
Yes,
like in line with the spaced repetition. Like if you sat down and you were like, Erickson stages, number 1, age 0 to 1, sensory motor, whatever. No, that's Piaget.
Yeah. Trust, mistrust.
Trust, mistrust. Thank you.
Yeah.
Clearly I didn't write those down recently. But anyway, point being, like, I think that's an underutilized tool, and especially in like the digital age when we like to type things out and keep our notes all organized and structured and things, like
Yep.
something about writing something down on a piece of paper
It
and
sticks,
doing it
man.
from scratch, like where you have nothing in front of you and you have to just recreate something. I think that's really valuable. So while I
Agreed.
think for this particular topic, it's kind of broad strokes are more important. I think that could be a helpful tool to learn specifics if you so desired, and it's not unhelpful. But for other concepts in psychosocial and otherwise, that writing those things down and making yourself think it through without any help can be really valuable as well.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, I mean that's all I got. Eric, if you're all set there,
Yes, sir.
we appreciate everybody for tuning in. As always, we hope you found this discussion of development helpful and found not just some helpful information, but ways of retaining that information as well. Happy studying, keep up the good work, and we'll see you guys next time on the next episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. Take care, everybody.